Hello, hello, hello. Back now today to talk about Sara Ahmed's The Cultural Politics of Emotion. Now, before jumping into that, a few things to say. You can follow me on Instagram if you want to see pictures of my cats, mostly at theory_and_philosophy. You can also find this in podcast form pretty much anywhere you get podcasts, now even on Spotify because it wasn't there for a while, but it's now there. You can support me via PayPal or Patreon if you want, if you have the means to. Obviously, that would be great. And I'd like to thank Amrit, Anshul, Boz, Henrik, James, John, Eust, Julio, Killswitch, Matt, and Paul, who have all been really helpful in keeping this going, because it's a lot of work. But even if you... at this point in our lives, if you did think about contributing to me, maybe consider deferring that, and any amount you wanted, you thought about throwing my way, consider throwing in the direction of Black Lives Matter or other organizations that are fighting for the rights of marginalized people all over the world, specifically in the United States and Canada, especially organizations that are fighting for the rights of sex workers, because these people often get forgotten, or trans people, especially Black trans people and Indigenous people. So, consider them definitely before me. Now, without then further ado, and also, I've been told that there are tons of ads on YouTube, and I don't get to control when they're put. At least I don't think I can. But on the podcast form, there shouldn't be any ads, so that would be a lot better for everyone, except me, because then I'd lose money. But whatever. Anyways, okay, shut up, David. So this book starts with an introduction, like almost every book, titled "Feel Your Way." So she begins this book and this chapter by considering a British poster that says this. At least this is part of it. Every day of every year, swarms of illegal immigrants and bogus asylum seekers invade Britain. And this is all funded by you, signaling that the person reading that sign is the person paying for it, ostensibly, through tax dollars. Now, Ahmed wants to ask with this book three broad things. She wants to ask what emotions do. She wants to ask how the nation, that is a country, comes to embody a kind of identity. So the nation can then, in its embodiment, can be hurt, can feel sad, can be angry, can be vulnerable. She's asking how that happens. And then finally, she's asking, how does the you, the person being addressed, which is most often in these settings, the kind of dominant part of the dominant class, dominant race, dominant sex and gender. How does that you become wrapped up with this national identity? So these are kind of three guiding questions that'll keep us, in line through the course of this. Now, of course, the construction of the you in this poster, that is the you that is paying for these so-called illegal immigrants, only works through the act of othering. Right? So you cannot constitute or create someone who is a you, that is the person being addressed, without them knowing themselves to be different from an other. Now, this can happen, if we're going to get a little bit philosophically technical for a second, in all cases, throughout all of, all of humanity, we know ourselves to be ourselves because we are not this other person around us, or we know we have bodily autonomy because we, are bound by our own skin in our own body. That's not what Ahmed is talking about here. She's talking specifically about the way that the you constituted in this poster is contingent. It's dependent upon the construction of an exterior to the nation, other. That is most often a racialized other. So an anxiety develops then about this other, because this you, this person that identifies with the nation, feels that when the nation is under threat, they themselves feel like they are under threat. So when you have a poster like this that suggests that these people are coming in swarms, which obviously is meant to dehumanize, it's meant to kind of equate these people with locusts, I guess might be one kind of insect to relate them to. They pose a threat. And then therefore the social body feels themselves to be under threat. Now what this reveals, and this is perhaps not, I think it's true, but I don't think that the kind of subject that Ahmed is talking about here, in this case the kind of white national subject, the one that's assumed to be part of the nation, I don't think they would accept this to be true, which is interesting. But Ahmed says that this reveals that the nation is a very fragile thing, because if it wasn't fragile, there wouldn't be this need to kind of defend it in these ideological ways, to constantly reconstitute the formation of a you in relation to an other. And this has to be repeated over and over and over again, almost to make sure that it doesn't go away. Because if it was a secure thing, if the nation was strong, this wouldn't be necessary. So in her words, this reveals that the nation is too emotional, too easily moved by the demands of others. So then there are calls to make the nation more secure. You get calls that, are very much floating around the United States. Like today, as I'm recording this, I was just reading about how the 200th mile of the United States border wall was completed. It's something, at least I can speak for myself, I had forgotten about that was being made because of everything else that's going on. But this is part of that desire to secure the nation that is viewed as being rather weak. But these white subjects don't want to admit that. And okay, I want to say something about my use of the word subject, because for some people that might be a little bit dissonant. When I'm referring to it here, I mean people who are in a position of relative privilege and authority. So the subjects of the nation are the ones that exist within the nation and accrue certain kind of social capital through that so they can then experience certain benefits. So these subjects want the nation to be secure because they fear the idea of the nation being penetrated, Ahmed says. And in that, the nation is associated with a kind of gendered, associated with women, in that it is at risk of being penetrated. Of course, Ahmed doesn't subscribe to that. She's just trying to diagnose how these people understand the nation and how it is understood in terms of the threats ostensibly posed to it. So later on in the book, she's going to talk about terrorism and post 9/11, because this book was written in 2004, I believe it came out. So through all this, she shows that emotions are what bind people together, right? In this kind of national identity. And it isn't a rational thing, right? It's not as though people are sitting in a room, in these suits, and they're contemplating how to best deal with maybe these so-called asylum seekers or illegal immigrants. These are people screaming in the streets, being exceptionally emotional about it. And one figure that might stand out to us would be like Alex Jones, if anyone knows who that is, the infamous conspiracy theorist and host and creator, I think, of InfoWars, who is a very emotional person who likes to scream and yell about what is happening to America. And this is all incredibly ironic, because emotionality, the idea that you are too emotional, has often been associated with, women, often associated with people that don't care about the nation, right? They're just, emotional people that, are against freedom and democracy and everything like that. So why is it that when a white man screams and yells, and Alex Jones isn't the best example because not many, I assume not too many people take him seriously. But when you have certain figures like Rush Limbaugh is another good one, Rand Paul, And these are all people I just happen to despise. And even Rand Paul's dad, Ron Paul. There is an emotionality behind what motivates their discourse and motivates their kind of political agenda, in that they feel that there is a threat to America and they are allowed to be upset about it. So Ahmed asks, because apparently this has nothing to do with emotion per se, or disavowing people on the basis of emotion. She asks whose emotions are allowed and what can those emotions look like? Because I'm sure we've all heard it in our lives that if a woman is crying, she's being too emotional. But when men are out after a hockey game where their team lost, like destroying cars and stuff, we very rarely hear that they're being too emotional. That doesn't enter our lexicon. It doesn't come out of our mouths, which is very interesting. So what is emotion for Ahmed? Because that's what the book is called. It's the cultural politics of emotion. For her, she defines emotion as the feeling of bodily change. And this is an embodied thing. This happens within us, and we can feel it. It doesn't exist like purely in the mind. This is something that we feel extend from the mind into the body. And there is very often in emotions a kind of immediacy that we have very little control over. So when we are emotional, you can't just turn it off. And it'd be wrong to think that you could. It is in very many cases something that just kind of happens to us. And it happens to us because of, our own history. It happens to us by the contact that we have with other things in that moment. So someone might break down and cry from seeing, a wonderful work of art, which is apparently a phenomenon that happens. It's something that makes sense. So when we see this work of art and we feel this kind of emotional response, that emotional response does not purely exist within us. And we are not just conjuring it up in relation to this thing that exists objectively out there. Because for Ahmed, the emotion is bound up with the thing that is eliciting it. So that it's not as though that object out there is the creator of that emotion, because for someone else, that work of art might not produce this emotion. So therefore, we have to be very careful not to say that, some objects are emotional or some people are emotional and some aren't. We have to instead consider the ways that for certain people with certain histories meeting certain objects with certain histories can produce these effects and affects. So this is a distinction that I'm making here between effect and affect. And this is a difficult one because affect is by no means easy to grasp. And this is because, I could go on for a long time about this, but it comes down to the roots of what phenomenology is, which is a long word that I'll try to explain quickly. Phenomenology is the idea that as humans, we come in contact with the world. And this isn't because the world exists out there objectively. It is because we have the capacity to grasp the world through our senses. So our five senses, in a sense, constitute it. They create the world because the world does not exist objectively to us. It only exists to us through our senses. So when we smell something from the world, let's say the smell of freshly cut grass, we are not actually smelling freshly cut grass because we smell it and then our bodies turn that smell into sense data that goes into our brains, and then our brains produce a certain stimulation or tells us to kind of feel a certain effect that we can then make sense of, that we then associate with cut grass. There's a show on Netflix, and this is an old experiment, but I just want it to be more topical. There's a show on Netflix called Magic for Humans. And in this show, the magician does this trick where he gets this person to sit at a table. And he divides up the person's torso, essentially, with a kind of wooden cutout so that the person can't see their own arm. Instead, the magician puts a fake arm where the person believes their arm to be. Now, what this magician shows is that because the person does not see their real arm, they then come to substitute their real arm with the fake mannequin arm. So the magician then hits the mannequin arm, and the person winces and feels pain and certain stimulations, even though they are not objectively being touched. They aren't objectively, pain is not happening to them. But at the same time, the magician pokes and stimulates the person's real hand, and they do not respond. So we must then ask, how objective are our experiences of the world? Because if we have, our sense of sight cut off, or it's, kind of obfuscated or distorted because of this substitution of an arm with this fake arm, it really questions how, real this world out there is and how it is determined by our senses. So this is what we mean by affect. Objects work upon us not because they have an objective essence in the world, but because we engage with them through our senses. So there's a giving and taking here, where I work upon the thing via my senses, and the thing inputs itself upon us. So there's a kind of reciprocal relation here. So in that encounter, I am not the only thing affected. That object is also affected. Let's go back for a second to the painting, the idea of this wonderful work of art. A work of art only attains its value as such if it is accepted as such. So, this work of art, to a person that might come from a completely different cultural background, might not look upon the work of art with any kind of strong emotional response. In fact, they might show indifference to this work of art. So that then asks, how do these people who feel an emotional connection to this work of art that they break down and cry, how does that act of crying actually reinforce the art's position as a thing that can elicit these responses? And then we must ask, how much of the fact that this art can do this is determined by, is contingent upon its existing as a work of art, probably in a museum at this point, or an art gallery or something, that in a sense sets the tone for how we are supposed to respond to it. And it is through these repetitive acts, so many people experiencing this over and over and over and over and over again, that the object comes to take on more kind of cultural meaning, more cultural value, which can then produce more of these responses. But that's all very, in a lot of, that's me talking here. This isn't really Ahmed. So in her words, describing this kind of giving and taking, she says emotions are relational. They involve reactions or relations of towardness or awayness in relation to such objects. So emotions are social for Ahmed. They exist as a kind of sociality of emotions. They are effects of circulation for her, and they belong to a general economy of feeling, where they circulate in a certain kind of cultural setting that then gives certain things certain meanings. So there's a kind of pop psychology book by Lisa Barrett, I believe, called How Emotions Are Made, in which she makes essentially this argument with all the kind of scientific evidence and all the studies that kind of prove this. But emotions don't exist out there in the world. In fact, the ways that we convey emotions, that is in a kind of, I'm going to speak from a North American setting, do not translate to every kind of cultural paradigm, where something like smiling for some cultures is not seen as a sign of kindness or friendliness. It is seen as an act of hostility because you are showing your teeth if you smile. And to show one's teeth is to, like with a predator, is to show that you're ready to bite the person, or at least you want to demonstrate that you have the capacity to bite someone. So in saying all this, Ahmed is trying to move beyond a kind of psychological model to study emotions. She's saying that the psychological model interiorizes emotions far too much. Instead, she wants to oppose that to an inside-out model, where the outside works on the inside and the inside works upon the outside. And it's not as though all emotions are just housed in the brain, because they circulate, right? They exist in a kind of in cultural settings and social settings, religious settings, everything like that. And she wants to qualify this, though, and this is where it gets really interesting, but also very tricky. She says that even this idea of there being an inside, like a psyche, and an outside, or a field of kind of where the social is, she says that even that is a distinction that is created through emotions. And that is a distinction that doesn't necessarily exist before that, which is interesting. And I happen to like it a lot. So this kind of puts us here to conclude the intro, where she says that this book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, looks at things like, she focuses on Australia and Australia's treatment of their indigenous people. She looks at the responses to international terrorism and the responses to refugees and immigrants all over the Western world. And that puts us here into chapter 1, titled The Contingency of Pain. So she begins this with a long quote by Christian Aid that essentially, and it appears to be a very good thing, they're trying to rid the world of landmines, which I think would be good if no one had landmines. That'd probably be good. And she says that the word landmine here is meant to communicate the pain that it causes beyond drawing the reader's attention to the specific object. So this quote describes the way that someone suffers from a landmine, which makes, it's not surprising. Landmines are horrendous. But what this does is it, very much in keeping with the first quote we talked about, it constitutes the reader as the subject of its address. So it interpolates the subject. And interpolate is a French word that comes from Louis Althusser. And Althusser argues that subjects are born when they are called upon in a kind of, in relation to some form of power. And you are, as a subject, you become a subject of that power when you are recognized in the eye of that power. And then you can accrue certain benefits, but these are benefits that are always already determined by the system in which you are found. And I won't go further into it than that, but I should do that essay, even though I have political reasons not to present Althusser. Anyway, so sorry, off track here. So you become the subject of the address here. And what happens with this quote is that the suffering of others it overshadows the people themselves. And what happens then is that there is a distinction made, or kind of revitalized or rejuvenated, between us and them. And the them, that is the people who, experience these horrendous things, are associated not with their own identities, not with their own cultures, not with their own beliefs, but with their suffering from landmines. And of course, we could take all of this with a grain of salt, because Christian Aid is a very problematic organization, right? We have to question how much of their political agenda influences their so-called humanitarian one, or the religious agenda influences that, where it seems like their desire to rid the world of suffering is not necessarily motivated by a desire to make the world better, but by a desire to accrue more religious value or capital. And what this does additionally is it makes the other seem like they are in constant need of help. They are in, the West has to take it upon themselves to be the world's caregivers And of course, that completely erases the fact that the West's so-called capacity to give as caregivers has been entirely dependent upon their having taken from most of the people on Earth, from having colonized, from having exploited, all of that. And we erase that history, and it becomes just, we look at our might. We have so much to give. We have to give to people, which is just another way to extend indebtedness, to make them, to put people in debt, essentially, because of our generosity. I'm using air quotes, generosity. So she then considers pain, because that's what the title of the chapter is, right? The contingency of pain, after meditating on this pain of others. And she asks, what is pain? And she doesn't want to give an answer to that because, for everyone, pain is different. This is just a truth. If one of us have gone to the doctor and the doctor asks us to describe the pain we're feeling, I should probably only speak for myself. I always question it when I describe the pain I feel, or when they say scale your pain or rate your pain on a scale from 1 to 10. I'll give a number, and then a minute later or a second later, I'll be like, is it really that? Or am I just making that up? Like, how do I quantify pain? And in that way, it's a very difficult and stubborn thing. And this is something that doctors deal with. Like, the conferences deal with this problem of how to actually extract the most effective kind of testimony or truthful testimony from a patient so that you know exactly what they're describing. And it's a very difficult thing to do. And I'm not saying it has a solution, but it's something that people are certainly talking about and trying to work with. So instead of giving a kind of definition, because Ahmed has a ton of humility, even though she's wicked smart, what pain does is a lot more interesting to her than defining it per se. She says that pain allows us to have a sense of our skin as bodily surface. Because pain, if we're talking about it in a physical way, is always acted upon the skin. And what that does is it gives us a sense of our kind of bodily limitations, who we are as people in a sense, and it constitutes our surface. Now, if we are without pain, if we somehow live lives that don't have pain in them, which would be, I wish that for everyone, there's something kind of negative that comes from that, in that we lose sight then of our skin. We lose sight of our kind of selves because we aren't feeling that specific sensation. And I guess other things could fill in that void, like pleasure, or that give you a sense of your skin, give you a sense of your body. But there's no denying that without pain, there's something kind of lost. And I want to say that I don't know if this loss is good nor bad, and I don't know if Ahmed wants to say that either. But she does say that when we experience pain, we add that sensation, that our memory of that thing, to our kind of archive of feelings, which is a term she borrows from Anne Svetkovich, whose book is of the same name, An Archive of Feelings. We add that to our own archive of feelings so that we can, not do the thing that hurts us again. You will only touch the hot stove once, and then that's it. Like you've learned your lesson. And without that, without that possibility to kind of amass this history, this kind of archive, it feels like there's a loss of what it means to grow then, at least for me. But I'm not in any way romanticizing pain, and people experience it on totally different levels than others. So yeah, just we're treading this very carefully here. So when you have certain subjects that don't feel pain, or that are kind of live pretty safe, happy lives, Ahmed says that they construct pain. And she gives the analogy of, like, it feels like I'm being stabbed in the back or something, when you're describing an emotional instance, where if someone betrays you emotionally, like they go behind your back to talk to your boss or something, you say you feel like you were stabbed in the back because the emotional pain is not enough. Like, we have to bring it to a kind of physical one because we can all ostensibly relate to that. But we only know or kind of have an idea about what being stabbed in the back means by kind of collective understanding of that thing. That isn't to say we've all experienced being stabbed in the back, but as a kind of cultural signifier, it has a certain meaning. And so when you say that, no one says, "Oh, well, what do you mean? Well, stabbed in the back where?" Like, if you get stabbed in the shoulder, it's very different than being stabbed in like the kidney or something. No one says that, right? We just know what they're saying. So pain is then informed by both our kind of personal histories and the cultural history, the kind of cultural situation in which we find ourselves. Not to mention as well the object that is inflicting this pain. So she really wants to emphasize that this opens up the possibility to consider pain not as a kind of homogeneous phenomenon, but one that is experienced differently by different people, depending on the histories from which those people come, and the histories of those people or objects that are inflicting the pain. So with something like racism or violence committed against Black people, what we see there is a very different kind of violence and a very different kind of subsequent pain than when, I don't even know, if someone gets hit by a car. I don't know why that's the example that I could only come up with. But when we have a history meeting another history, we have to account for both. Where in the case of racism, this doesn't just happen out of nowhere. This doesn't just happen as a one-time thing. This is something that has been happening repeatedly. And with that, we see pain become intensified. And as we are seeing, the response to that pain is intensifying. And soon, if hopefully not yet, very soon, people will grow absolutely dissatisfied with it and will not accept it any longer. This isn't to say that the onus should be on Black people to undo systemic violence. Absolutely not. Even though that seems to be the case, it's the responsibility of the oppressors to undo that violence, to make amends. Which is kind of segues us here into how she wants to consider pain, the pain inflicted upon others in Australia, with the colonizers inflicting pain upon the indigenous communities. So she says that she considers here the what was called Bringing Them Home report that outlined the harms experienced by Australian indigenous people through colonization. So the Bringing Them Home report was a kind of way by which Australia, at least ostensibly, would come face to face with the violence that it committed against its indigenous population. And its indigenous population, as though, why did I say it that way? As though the indigenous people belong to Australia, which is certainly not the case. So what this report did was reveal the necessity to consider kind of national shame rather than personal guilt. So while it would be nice if people felt personal guilt, it isn't like any of the people living in Australia, and the same can be applied to the Americas over here as well. It's not as though any of us were part of that kind of colonization. And I'm putting a big asterisk here saying, like, of course we should still feel guilt, but just for now, let's pretend that personal guilt will get us nowhere. So the Bringing Them Home report tries to emphasize a kind of national shame, where the nation, rather than individuals, should feel guilty for what happened. But she's suspicious of this. And the reason why she's suspicious of this is because as soon as we consider the nation as being the thing that should feel guilt, what we are doing then is saying that the nation is a white nation. And the white people that committed these harms should, that they belong to that national shame and should feel bad. Now, what that does is it reinscribes the idea that the nation is white. The nation has its European roots, and that is never going to change. All that the nation needs to do is feel bad for it, and then it can move on. Maybe it'll make some amends, have some kind of, pay people back in certain, compensatory ways. But that doesn't get at the heart of the matter. In fact, it's just a very subtle way for Ahmed that the idea of the nation is reinforced. So what she says then is reconciliation becomes, in this narrative, the reconciliation of indigenous individuals into the white nation, which is now cleansed through its expression of shame. So healing, in this sense, is seen as the healing of the nation having done wrong, instead of the healing of the indigenous people that have been hurt, right? And this is kind of what happens with like white tears, where if a white person is called out for being racist, and this might be a well-minded, left-leaning white person who happens to say something that is racist, and they have a very strong reaction. They might start like crying and feeling really bad about what they did. And then it becomes the task of those people that called them out. In this case, let's say they happen to be black people, calling out the racist person. Then it becomes the black people's responsibility to make the racist person feel less bad and be like, oh no, you're not that bad. Like you're really okay. You're a good ally, things like that, which takes attention away from their racist action and makes it about how they are the victim. The white person is the victim in that way, or in that setting. So a better response for Ahmed, and she's not saying that this is like this will solve the problem, but she's saying that a better response would be that people actually feel in their core, because we are part of these nations, we identify with them. In my case, it's Canada. We identify with Canada as the nation to which we belong. Even if we renounce with all our hearts this kind of patriotism assumed of that, we still have to acknowledge that we exist and we experience and enjoy certain benefits offered by this national identity. So we have to recognize that and become uncomfortable as a first step. We have to recognize that our comfort in this world is predicated very much upon the fact that we have, in the case of Canada, just a few years ago, segregated, tore people from their homes so that we could have this thing called Canada, and force them into residential schools where they wouldn't have their culture or their families, which is obviously a very tragic thing. So in this way, colonialism represents a very specific kind of violence because it imparts itself on colonized bodies, forcing them to become one with the colonizers, lest they suffer. So if you don't, do what we say, you're going to suffer. And this is, I'll say in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be doing Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, which is, I think, a very nice supplement to this text. But that propels us here into chapter 2, the organization of hate. So she starts this chapter with a quote from the Aryan Nations website, in which they argue that racism and xenophobia are the products of love for the nation, whites and men, that these are not signs of hate. So of course Ahmed doesn't like that, right? Ahmed is very, very suspicious of these efforts by hate groups to claim that what they're doing is love, that they're really love groups. So the racists say they love their nation, they love their fellow white people, they love their culture, which are things that they feel to be under attack by people that hate them. So they align themselves with victims. They say that they are victims to someone else's hatred, and their love is what is going to stop this hate. So when they do this, they're doing something, it's almost clever, even though it's not deliberate. Ahmed says that these people, when they align themselves with love instead of hate, they kind of erase themselves, and they allow themselves to disappear into the folds of the nation, into the folds of the kind of dominant identity, where they do not mark themselves as special or powerful or superior. They just mark themselves as the ordinary, ordinary, hardworking Americans that are at risk of losing their jobs because of, big government, because of corporations, because of immigrants, because of, terrorists, anything like that. So what they do there is they normalize their position in the world, and that can't be questioned at all. And it's really clever, because we then, come to think, who is the face of America, or who is the face of Canada? And it's that hardworking, rural, white person, right, that wears, the plaid and the jeans, always jeans. But yeah. So hate then doesn't exist in isolation, right? It belongs to a general economy, or it circulates in a specific social and cultural setting. And it is directed at others laterally, right? It's directed at, immigrants who supposedly hate. And I'm using America just because the rhetoric is so in your face, even though the exact same things are applicable to Canada without a doubt, the setting I'm from. But it's just easy to scapegoat the States as though it's only happening there, because it is so much more in our faces. But in no way do I think that Canada is any better. So in the case of the United States, when people are saying that immigrants hate America, or, protesters hate America, unless, of course, they're protesters who want to get haircuts because of COVID, then that's fine. Those protesters are okay. But protesters fighting against police violence, not okay. Those aren't okay. Or when they were just taking a knee at football games, like that, and that wasn't acceptable. So there is no acceptable transgression in the United States, unless it is conducted by white people, which seems to be the only case. White people can riot in the streets and have no tear gas thrown at them, but black people fighting police violence, and then that's it. So she considers this. She considers the role of hate in a kind of economy of feelings to bridge the gap between psychoanalysis and Marxism, or to kind of point to how they can be read in dialogue. Now, I don't want to take a whole lot of time and go into each of those things, because it's a lot. But what she's saying is that through Marxism, we can understand the kind of economy of effects and how they float as a kind of exchange. They are exchanged, and how they come to affect minds with psychoanalysis. So for Ahmed, the more that signs circulate, the more effective and affective they become. So there's, oh God, I don't know if I'll remember the name. It was like a documentary that depicted the representation of Arabic people in popular American culture. And they're often associated with the terrorist, right? So often is that image conveyed. And when that image is circulated over and over again, when it is repeated over and over and over again, it gains more and more traction. And it is able to produce and elicit, that is, to produce in the individual, the same response as others, as other people. So through circulation, there is a kind of gravitation towards a homogeneous response to something. But hate is clever because it doesn't just want to associate it with a single person, and it's very malleable. So 1 week or one month probably, it's like the terrorists. Another month it's protesters. Another month it will be immigrants. Another month it will be asylum seekers, quote unquote asylum seekers. And that serves a certain function for Ahmed in that it allows hate to be easily transferred onto easily marked scapegoats. So for her, the impossibility of reducing hate to a particular body allows hate to circulate in an economic sense. And hate, interestingly enough, actually has something in common with love, because hate doesn't want the other. In this case, where it belongs to a kind of circulation of effects, to an economy of effects, hate doesn't want the other that it hates to disappear. It actually depends upon that other, because that other, the person that the subject hates, the other exists so as to constitute, to galvanize or to construct the idea of the self, of the subject, where, an analogy we could give is that we don't know what warmth is without cold. We need these kind of relative markers to give an identity to something. So we know ourselves as subjects because we are able to position our subjecthood in relation to an exterior other. And we can strengthen that separation if we associate the other with hate. So we say that the other hates us. And what that does, it doesn't speak any truth, but what it does is it makes ourselves a stronger entity in the nation because we galvanize a stronger group identity than in relation to that hateful other. God, I hope that made sense. So hate maintains a relationship, even though it's a relationship predicated upon dislike and hatred. It maintains the other in proximity to a subject. So how can we talk about hate in this setting without considering something like a hate crime? So Ahmed considers that for a moment. She says that the hate crime, at least how it is interpreted in the law, in the legal sense, is often wrong. Where she says that in the legal sense, a hate crime is understood as an act upon a person based on their race, gender, class, one of these markers of identity. They are attacked on the basis of that. Now, what Ahmed says is that by designating a hate crime as that, as the violence inflicted upon someone on the basis of their race, gender, or class, or anything else, what that does is it forgets that hate is actually reconstituted in each one of these acts. And what is even more, these identity markers, and they are often racialized and sexualized ones, where the white subject is often seen as being the neutral one, these identity markers are actually rejuvenated and revitalized with each hate crime. And these are acts of repetition, repetitive hate, that constitute the other as an other in relation to a transparent, neutral white subject that doesn't get seen as being associated with color or with the male subject with gender, anything like that. And what that ultimately does is it reduces the hate crime to an individual instance, forgetting that, of course, it comes from the very strong history. So I think that with that, I'll wrap up this episode and can finish it in the next episode. But if I said anything wrong or I mischaracterized Ahmed in any way, I'd love to hear about it. But if you want to help me, if you want to contribute without giving money, obviously by liking and subscribing would be cool. But if not, then obviously don't feel obliged. But anyways, take care.